It's not uncommon for certain franchises to go through highs and lows, especially in Nintendo's case, because they like to experiment so much with whatever idea they make up. It's not so odd for some series to shift their genre occasionally. Naturally, not every change is welcome, and despite the fact Nintendo is praised for their determination to venture into unknown territory, their stubbornness can also be their greatest flaw. One particular IP, however, stands above this balance of safe quality and trying to be different, with people commonly claiming there are no bad entries within said series. With nearly 40 titles in the series, Kirby is one of Nintendo's strongest and most consistently present franchises of their catalogs of IPs. Having such a number of representatives, it's easy to assume there might be some hiccups, because you're not always going to hit the nerve of time. Surprisingly enough, if you're going to listen to fans of Kirby, you might have come across the sentiment that Kirby has no bad games. If you have followed this channel, you're probably aware how rarely I truly critique Kirby. Not because I'm a filthy fanboy, well, only to some extent, but due to the fact there are no opportunities. Needless to say, not everyone will agree, but even if there is one title you would consider a disappointment, it's hard to call the worst Kirby game truly bad. This is why players like to say it's a bad Kirby game and not a detrimental experience in general. Still, why is it then that Kirby as a franchise is presumably so great and not way bigger than now? While everyone basically knows the pink glutton, it's not like the series sells millions of copies with each entry and is instead mildly successful. First of all, let's determine when a franchise can be considered to be flawless or at least widely consistent. It may sound strange, but we are going to leave personal taste aside and focus on factors like the established genres, what players expect from new games, and in which case a series seems to lose track of what is important. To build the foundation, let's have a look at examples, one of them executing this idea rather competent and the other not so much. Despite the fact The Legend of Zelda is probably one of Nintendo's most long-time trial and error series, with every new entry concentrating on a specific gimmick, there's also an essential foundation never to be broken, even in Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom. While The Wind Waker and Twilight Princess are vastly incomparable in style, visuals and tone, they still share the same primary gameplay of exploring a world, fighting intimidating bosses and solving puzzles in dungeons. This skeleton was built in the very first The Legend of Zelda and still holds up to this day. You might argue Breath of the Wild is the outsider and changed the series into a direction far apart from what we knew, but this is only partially true. Obviously, there are no traditional dungeons anymore and the progression style is altered thanks to the open world, and even though I too think Breath of the Wild could inherit more classic Zelda elements, it's still a Zelda game no matter how you look at it. You're still solving puzzles, fight great enemies and explore a breathing world. The direction might be different, but the pure soul of the series is not vanished and the very basic gameplay untouched. In a sense, it represents what the very first The Legend of Zelda tried to encapsulate back in the day, albeit for the sake of sacrificing seemingly standardized traditions that may have made the franchise popular in the first case. This also goes for certain exceptions that still prove the rule. Triforce Heroes, for instance, plays out like a Mario game to some extent, with offering bite-sized levels and focusing much more on the multiplayer, something the series seldom dives into. It could be considered a betrayal to the roots of The Legend of Zelda, but not so much in hindsight. Like I mentioned many times before, you're still fighting powerful opponents, solve puzzles and obtain memorable items along the way. The exploration might not be on the same level, but is held back for the sake of a more accessible, quick entrance to the game. While I think of it as a true Zelda game, Triforce Heroes is one of the unpopular ones, so you can clearly see that deviating from what made the series great in the first place is not received warmly, no matter how interesting the new foundation could be. This leads us directly to our second example, Paper Mario. A once charming RPG franchise mixing up the Mario universe turned into, well, it seems like even Nintendo doesn't really know. To some extent, it's even hard to call the series a RPG franchise, since 4 out of 6 games aren't even traditional RPGs anymore and often follow a mishmash of whatever genres. Super Paper Mario for the Wii was the first step into the presumably downfall of the series, but is not solely responsible. Just like with Triforce Heroes, the gameplay might be a complete simplification of what Paper Mario was known for, but everything else, be it characters, tone, settings or stories, still maintain the quirky spirit. Back in the day, players were disappointed because a 2D platformer isn't something Mario has never done, but no one knew Nintendo would stick their finger into their throats even further to see how much they can simplify a series that once stood for creativity beyond the graphical premise of a paper world. Enter Sticker Star, the beginning of the end, and to this day, one of Nintendo's most unpopular titles as a whole. The horse is already as dead as it could be, and the downsides of this experimental title are more than apparent. The main reason why people are more favorable towards Super Paper Mario instead of Sticker Star is simply due to how Super Paper Mario only takes the liberty of one oopsie with its gameplay in comparison to appearing like the first result of an unexperienced indie developer. It's really hard to imagine how the same people who created one of the most tragic love stories for the series or a murder mystery on a train turned into throwaway comedians with plain obvious jokes that do not become funnier if you repeat them 3 times. Color Splash and Origami King take steps into a brighter looking direction, but it's hard to pat Nintendo's head for walking towards a standard they set over 20 years ago. Super Paper Mario might be the exception, but everything that came afterwards would have perfectly synergized as an RPG, and once you do not offer what made people like the series in the first place, there's no wonder they turn skeptical. To simply summarize what you have to do to offer no bad games, it's not necessarily about the gameplay, as major changes can be excused as long as you keep the spirit of the franchise. The perfect instance is our prime poster child himself, Kirby and his countless spin-offs. There might be nearly 40 titles, but nearly half of them are spin-offs with completely unlike gameplay premises, and yet players welcome every new endeavor with open floating arms. Part of the reason might be there's always the assurance of receiving a traditional mainline entry at some point, but some experiments, like Air Ride, are put on the same level and sometimes even go beyond the main platformer series. Not all spin-offs are the same though. A couple of them are clearly way more ambitious, as Epic Yarn and Battle Royale clearly do not stand in comparison to each other. Often it's the home console titles offering a similar complete experience, but even smaller eShop only releases carry some charm to them. Still, there's no series with only good games apart from F-Zero probably, and from time to time some mediocre entries appear on the surface. In Kirby's case this might depend on the person you are asking, but generally speaking, Rat Attack and Star Allies are often considered to be disappointments. Especially Star Allies failed to deliver after being the first proper HD title and follow-up to the arguably best Kirby game in the franchise. It kinda redeemed itself with 3 updates and can probably never shake off the reputation of being just okay. The very same could be said about Rat Attack, also being the first mainline title on a new handheld and similarly lukewarm. What links both of these titles is not necessarily that they are bad. Even enemies of Star Allies would most likely say it's an alright game. If you set a standard, you set expectations, and everything that is not on the same level as a Planet Robobot will immediately be considered a lesser total package. This criticism, however, comes from comparison, which is a completely different basis. I do not have to compare Paper Mario Sticker Star to any prior games in the series, because even on its own, Sticker Star suffers from severe downsides that have nothing to do with not being an RPG. The only reason entries like Star Allies or Rat Attack are so skeptically received is because they are simply not as good as what came before. They do not show fatal design mistakes and at worst are just a little boring or uncreative. Of course, you may hate a certain title for whatever personal reasons, but every Kirby game generally succeeds in what it wants to be while keeping the spirit of the franchise. It goes without saying that you can point out flaws in any title, even quality ones like The Forgotten Land. The threshold between genuine drawbacks and mere nitpicks is very slim, as a matter of fact, and one of the main reasons why it's so hard to critique Kirby is because it's quite troublesome to critique the franchise as a whole. The creators behind Kirby are known to be extremely passionate about their most reliable IP and treat Kirby's representation with utmost care and detail. One essential point you often hear when it comes to Mario is the lack of remembering the past. Fan favorite characters like Farfall regularly stick to their respective series or do not appear at all anymore behind their initial introduction, and there are only very few exceptions of key figures becoming a prominent character throughout the years. Pauline kinda went through a resurrection, but this doesn't mean she will stay, as Toadsworth seemed to be in a similar position and is now gone since years. Kirby seems to always remember even the most obscure characters, be it in games or at least artworks, and the generous sense of fan service is so strong it's ironically one of the weak points of Star Allies for relying too much on it. The very same goes for the lore, which seems to recollect snippets from most entries in a way no one would have imagined. Triple Deluxe having a strong connection to the amazing mirror just comes out of nothing, but makes the universe so much more believable and alive despite not following a clear timeline or something similar. We receive what we love, which is why the gameplay stays true to the original formula basically introduced in Kirby's Adventure, but occasionally seasoned with one twist. And if there's room for something new, one of the countless spin-offs usually fulfill that need, and probably also stop franchise fatigue for the developers. What's more is the consistent release schedule. The only time a Kirby game felt reasonably rushed was Star Allies, and what a surprise, it was not very beloved. However, usually this is not the case for Kirby, and although there's the impression of getting a new Kirby game every year, they deliver and don't oversell their premise. If it's something smaller for the eShop, it's sold on a budget price or maybe even completely free. The consistent awareness that there will be a Kirby game pleases the fanbase, which might be one of the most peaceful ones considering its size. From my experience, if a franchise doesn't become too big but extended enough to remain relevant, it strikes this perfect balance of keeping mainstream schmucks away while having enough people to engage in conversations. And even if opinion seems to stray away, I always had the impression you can name basically every title in the series as your favorite one and people will see your point to a certain degree. Kirby's always good because Kirby's always safe, and whenever something didn't work out the way it was intended to, we always know there will be a safe mainline title in the future. This safe approach is also paradoxically the biggest flaw of the series, and maybe even the reason why it could never rise to the likes of a Mario or Zelda. The Forgotten Land was the first time since ages that Kirby dared to enter unknown territory, but even so, it was still very safe. You could perceive the Forgotten Land as a very literal, three-dimensional translation of 2D Kirby. Similar like Mario 3D Land, for instance, what is basically a 2D Mario game but in 3D. Once again, not detrimental on its own, but also a shame in consideration of the huge success. The Forgotten Land is the best-selling Kirby game of all time due to offering something genuine new for the franchise, and of all things, all the strengths are based on stuff that is untypical for the series. We are not used to realistic environments, we are not used to having voice acting and a song, and we are definitely not used for this kind of production value that rivals Nintendo's very own AAA squad. If at all, the only thing we can truly criticize Kirby for is not always going for this scope and being a little too safe in retrospective. In the future, we may see more willing to experiment, and by looking at the past, I'm not really scared they will deviate from the quality we always receive.